And welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you very much.
We're going to be talking about your new novel, The Wren. And usually you might ask an author, so what's this novel about, or where did your inspiration come from? But I think this is a novel that resists those sort of questions.
Actually, it takes me a while to know what a book is about anyway. And then you go around, it's like a second fiction you construct to say, oh yeah, no, that's what it's about. It's actually about the characters, and it's about the way they think and speak, and and about their worlds. About.
Well, you're right, it is about the characters, and that each of the three characters in this book have very different ways, I suppose, of communicating with the reader.
Sure.
So I thought we would start with that sort of stylistic approach. We have Phil, his daughter Carmel, and her daughter Nell. And we actually start with Nell. We start with the youngest in the book. Can you tell me a little bit about creating Nell as a character? And then we can talk about writing youth a little bit later.
Okay, so I was writing Nell's mother, Carmel. Early in lockdown, Carmel is a tough nut. And she's tough in a way that, Irish people might recognise. She's a very no-nonsense kind of character. And I was writing into Carmel's character for, I don't know, quite a long time. I don't know how long. And I thought, I didn't know where it was going to go, as you sometimes don't. And I was kind of painting myself into a corner, really, with Carmel. And then I thought, what would happen if she got pregnant? And, all the lights came on. It was like, okay, the sun came through the clouds. So I got my character pregnant. Take some logistics.
Yep.
You have to work all that out. And then a Nell arrived. And Nell has this quality that babies have of being utterly and completely herself from the first minute you see her. And that's something I've experienced in my own life about children. It's like, oh my God, they are like somebody really differently themselves. So I took that quality into the character of Nell, and suddenly I had the book. I didn't know what book I was writing. And then when Nell came, she brought the book with her. So I gave her the opening then of the book. So so Nell is a young character who is in many ways the opposite of her mother, but she's a bit like her grandfather, who is this poet, Phil.
I saw another interview actually, or heard another interview where you were saying that people keep asking you about Nell, about writing Nell, and how could you write a character who is young in today's world, sort of thing. And you sort of replied, well, I was young once, and I remember that. And you went back to your earlier writings to sort of think about how to approach that style. But what really struck me was that there's a difference between writing youth and there's a difference between writing contemporary youth, what the youth are going through today. And she in particular is going through a sort of a particularly difficult relationship that she's in, which felt to me to be a very modern thing. You mentioned again that you had been reading a lot of novels recently, and I think I have too, where women are in relationships with men who are neglectful or borderline abusive or even straight out abusive.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you approach that to make sure that you're writing somebody who felt real and genuine?
Okay, so that was in the ether, one way or the other. If you're reading young, as I like to read young writers, upcoming writers. So, I mean, even Megan Nolan just a couple of years ago was writing in Acts of Desperation. But if you go back again to Emma McBride, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, you're looking at a character who's in the full, fully given over to abject abusive relationships, abjectly given over to abusive relationships. And this was, like, for a feminist of my water, this is new, okay? So we thought back in the day that everyone's going to have a good time, okay? Starting now, okay? Starting now, it's all going to get better. So the idea that it took this kind of interesting turn was a bit of a challenge to me. But when I say, people aren't surprised when you write an old character. Nobody says, how do you know about old age?
Yeah.
But I'm not old yet.
Yeah.
And also young people sometimes get a bit territorial and say, well, we're completely different.
Yeah.
So these things are not true. They're just attitudes, they're just postures. And some of my early short stories dealt with a kind of disconnection, fragmentation, that kind of modernist space that is a post-traumatic space now, is identified as a post-traumatic space. And that is the place where those younger writers are writing in and from, out of. Writing out of. I think all writing is writing out of loss of some kind. And so stylistically, Nell is a kind of a modernist character in a way. And, you know, young people have invented, of course, so much. They didn't invent modernism. No, that's now. I'm being mean.
They can take it.
They can take it. But there are interesting things about writing the younger women writers. So someone like Sally Rooney is a political cast. So Nell has a political tilt to her because life requires that now. You know, because she feels undervalued or unvalued by the gig economy and by all the global machines of which she is a kind of a part, you know, a cog.
As you say, she has this sort of fragmented narrative, and that she is drifting somewhat in her life. What's interesting is that she finds this connection with her grandfather, which she has through watching this interview of him from the past on TV.
First of all, she reads his poems, though.
Yes.
So when she's growing up, she reads his poems. And she says, you know, when things got rough with her mother, she would curl up with Phil, who's the grandfather, and sweeten the heart. Now, she never met him, but she read the poems, and the voice is so gentle and so nice that it makes a lot of sense to her. She needs that kind of, you know, tact. He's tactful.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, you read things, and that is the disjunction that people are also getting their heads around now. You read this lovely work, and then you realise that the people who wrote it are not lovely.
Yeah.
And that's a late realisation, and everyone is going around clutching their heads going, oh my God, it wasn't nice after all.
Well, let's go to that actually, because...
actually, it's not always true. I mean, some of them are lovely.
Some of them, well, oh yeah, and people are complicated, of course. But there is this interesting thing about particularly artists or people who create, and this idea... I was talking with Claire Deeder recently about her book Monsters, and there she talks about, you know, these monstrous men who are allowed to be monsters because they're channeling something great, they're creating art and all the rest of it. And of course Phil in this book is a poet who does abandon his family in appalling circumstances, really, because, and this allows him to carry on creating his poetry. But that has obviously a huge impact on Carmel directly, but there is this interesting, as you say, this connection between Nell and Phil, who feels this connection to the poems. And there's a point where it's said that it was so easy to hate him because of what he had done, but so hard to dislike him, and even easier to love him. Devastatingly easy.
To love him.
Tell me a bit more about that, because I think that's really interesting.
Because when he died, all the words went with him, is what she says. They had all the words. He had all the words. Why had he all the words? So he was very charming. Yeah. And he continued to be charming, and although the charm, as it sometimes does, in later life, kind of detaches from the persona and doesn't feel as charming anymore. So that charisma gets a bit creepy at the end, towards the end. Of course, he left the family, and he did it in a kind of anguished way. So it's not like he didn't love his wife. He left her because he loved her. So that's the kind of nonsense that men were allowed to get away with in the day. You know? Yeah. Because it was all about them. Yep. And nobody called it out about, you know, that maybe it should be about other people too. Yeah. And my theory is that narcissism expands to fill the available space. Okay? So that male artists back in the day were given lots of space. Still are, to an extent, given lots of space. And that women in general, that kind of is quenched from day one. And then repeatedly on day two, and then many, many times on day three to the end of time, really. So you're not allowed to be monstrous. So when you complain about a certain style of man being monstrous, there's a jealousy in there too, isn't there? Why not me? Why am I not monstrous?
Yeah. Well, why don't I get to do that? Yeah. You mentioned there the words that die with him when he passes away. You have had to write these poems to put them into the book, which is a big thing to take on. I wonder how you felt creating these poems for him, whether that was much harder work, or did it come easily, or?
So there is one thing I knew about Phil, about the self-involved and whatever else he was, that his poetry involved a sense of reach, okay? That he was looking for something higher. He was trying to escape his own problematic self. So do we admire that or do we call it out? And is the result beautiful? And what do we think of all of that? These are great questions. Well, I wrote the poems with great difficulty. I suspect Phil found them difficult to write too, so I wasn't too worried about that. It's really hard to write poetry. I felt like a complete imposter. So I kind of worked on his formation as a poet for a long time. You know, Paddy Kavanagh is always there, but, you know, Pádraig Colum and Austin Clarke. And I went back through Austin Clarke to the bardic poets of the 18th century and went further back into 9th century Irish poetry. And that was just really lovely. So during lockdown, I was reading poetry in Irish for no reason. The way you did things during lockdown. Okay, that was the thing that I reached for. And I read these two poems about dead birds. One was about a bird that died of thirst when the lake became icy and it couldn't drink anymore. And the other was a poem about a lady's pet blackbird. And when, in those early weeks, when death was all around, I mean, it was the sense of, and these two tiny deaths from back in the, you know, from centuries old little birds, I just thought, oh my goodness, here I am. So they reached so, you know, so it was so piercing. The kind of path back to the poem was, and to the writer was so clear to me in those moments that I just you know, went back into the Irish when I then realised Phil could translate from the Irish. I was just completely delighted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the way that the poems are placed within the novel means that there's this amazing juxtaposition that happens between the different styles of each character's approach and then these poems. And again, I heard you saying that that is effectively how poetry often works, is that it has this juxtaposition of image and word that communicates something extra. So would that be what you were hoping to achieve with the structure of this novel, which for readers who are approaching it, it goes sort of not here, there and everywhere, but it moves around from place and time, doesn't it?
I'm very surprised. I mean, I'm taken by the response as I take the, you know, as I test the weather of the readership. I'm really taken by some readers who are saying, well, poems, I'm not reading them. Like, I have to kind of get what's going on in the book. I need to know. And others who get that they pause at the poem as a moment of stillness and meaning in the text that isn't quite explicable in shorthand. You know, it's doing setting something else running in your mind. But I'm delighted by the way the poetry now informs the prose, and people get the kind of lyricism in the voices, which are quite colloquial and quite ordinary voices. But I've kind of always put in a bit of that. It's always been there, that lyrical impulse. I've not necessarily trusted it in my own writing process. So to kind of bring it to the front like this is very good fun, very interesting, but it informs the book, the rest of the book, which is great. And people say, why do you put Nell in the first person and Carmel? I now, late in my writing process, say, you know, I did it because it feels right, and that's literally how it works, you know, for me. So I put it like that because that's them for me. So Phil, when I wrote Phil, it's in an old style. I mean, it's quite old-fashioned. It's quite lyrical, and it's full of there's a sweetness there that is on the edges into fraudulence.
Okay. We've sort of glided over Carmel, and she's an intriguing character because of this thing of having been abandoned by her own father, then seeking to get control of her own life. And that she wants to have a family, but she doesn't want the men to be involved. So she does this thing of getting pregnant and having that child on her own and keeping this incredibly close bond with her daughter, or trying to anyway. Tell me a bit about writing her, because again, very different approach, third person narration and a very controlled prose.
So I had a complaint that the men in the book were all very simple, but they're not actually very simple. They're quite complex. They are, however, disappointing.
Yeah.
So, and the first disappointment, I mean, they have to be disappointing because of this disappointment from Phil, you know? Yeah. So when Phil left, whatever Carmel was already became locked in, you know, around the age of 12 or so. So she shut herself down in this very kind of, it was very hard to write her. She has, people constantly accusing her of having no imagination. If she sees it, it exists. If it doesn't, it's of no interest to her. She's very practical. She's on her own. She has things to do. And I like that practicality about her. But I found it difficult to stay in the narrative because, of course, you couldn't. She's not going to sit and muse. She's not going to realise things about herself. She lacks insight. She's not interested in psychology. She's a known. She doesn't understand, for example, what anxiety is. Like tell what So she's very anti the sensitivity of the day. So Nell has that to deal with in her mother. So, but it was funny. It was comical also. But that shutting down, that literalism, produced quite an old style naturalism in the text and what I was writing. So she reads like quite a number of quite ordinary books, which made me wonder how limited those characters are, or why they're not, suddenly breaking out into Virginia Woolf. How do you keep them? How do you keep them?
Yeah.
Confined like that, and why do we call that normal?
Yeah.
Because people's lives are much more interesting than some books would have it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you've written about motherhood, and there is a huge aspect of Carmel's character which is connected to that. The fantastic description of when Nell is born and the baby is taken away from her, and she demands that it's brought back immediately, and it's like she will not let it go, that there is this special connection.
Yeah.
And then another moment later on, which is when you're talking about people getting tattoos and stuff, and the mama hex being that whatever it is that you put indelibly on your body will always be the wrong word, the wrong lover, the wrong place to put a shooting star. And I thought it was really interesting because she thinks that the only thing to have on you is a heart, and the only safe letters are M-U-M. So tell me a bit about that, because it's so crucial.
You're always going to love your mum, aren't you?
Yes, yeah. Got to
it's like you don't have a choice. It's like it's built in. Yeah, I mean, she has this astonishingly, the thing that Nell understands, as they have their argy-bargy, and the drama of separation is very interesting to me, the drama of separation and connection. When Nell is born, the baby looks at her, and Carmel thinks that she knows just how lonely Carmel has been all her life. So the baby is both fixes the problem, but also shows the problem, or brings the problem into the room.
Yeah.
And so the relationship doesn't always go well. But underneath is this absolute rock of Carmel's abiding love for Nell. And Nell kind of wants to get away from that, thank you very much. Yeah. But it's probably better in the long run to have it than be looking for it,
Yeah. Coming back to Phil, and I suppose this idea of creatives. Obviously, in your previous novel, Actress, you looked at the relationship between a mother and daughter, where the mother was an actress, and you yourself, of course, as a creative who's written about motherhood. And it seems to be there's always this thing. In fact, this brings me back to Claire Diderot's book, where she talks about the female monster, if she could find one, was the idea of the mother who abandons her child in order to create art. So she looked at Doris Lessing. And you obviously haven't done that with your own family, but I wonder whether you feel there's that balance, as authors often do, which is that to really focus on their work means to neglect their children up to a certain point, and that's this pressure that they feel that fathers often don't feel, because again, culturally, that's not placed on them.
Yeah, well, what are the cultural expectations here, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, weirdly, wherever you are writing, you're in a room, okay? What's outside the room is not really all that important. Evelyn Waugh had to have his children in a separate wing of the house, okay? But he was just, why is the outside of the room important? You're in your head. Yeah. Why do children intrude in some way, even if you're not looking after them? Yeah. So then you add the cultural expectations. I shouldn't use a friend of mine as an instance, but she had problems writing, and she said her son needed matching socks, and the socks had to have, they couldn't be just socks, they had to have Superman on them or Batman or whatever. So she was running around, instead of writing a short story, she was running around matching up socks, and I just didn't know what to say. And
Yeah.
now I'm making a feck of her by repeating this story because I would let them go barefoot rather than do that. I'm sorry. They can figure it out. I mean, or I did one day go to a shop and buy all white socks for me, all black socks for my husband, all blue socks for my son. And, whatever.
Yeah.
There's no sock business going on in my house. It's like,
You've employed the
they can all cook. They're all really good cooks.
because they've learned to do that themselves because...
Actually, their father's a really good cook.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It's like I do... I'm being a bit too chatty here now. I should be saying high-minded things about motherhood. But actually, there's an awful lot of stuff about motherhood that isn't high-minded and about love and apple pie. It's actually about drudgery and labour.
Yeah.
And some of it is unnecessary. And a lot of it, there's a huge weight of social expectation on it.
Well, as you say, I mean, this idea that...
Now I just get a pang of shame.
No.
I just go, oh my God, I've neglected my children. They're socks.
Well, because in many cases there will be a father, and nobody's expecting him to know what the sock situation is. There's this famous idea is that if you ask most men what size shoe their children are currently, the vast majority of them can't answer that question. They won't even get within 2 sizes. They have no idea.
They don't. Yeah.
And it's the mothers who are carrying what's called the heliostatic load, which is the burden of having to know all this information. What size shoe are they? When do they need to be dropped off at that club?
Well, I would expect my children to know their shoes.
Very good.
And they're quite capable of that, I think.
Well, I suppose there is an independence. I mean, Nell is an incredibly independent character up to a point, and then of course that's why her relationship with Phelim is so interesting because she's.
But Nell, when as a toddler, right? I mean, Carmel is thinking what were her first words, and she thinks they might as well have been "Asher, fuck it." She's one of those toddlers.
Yeah.
That's heading for the horizon. She's and that sense of autonomy is, I do love it. I do, personally. Apart from the fact that it involves less sock matching.
Just to finish off, as I said at the beginning, it's a novel that will sort of resist that idea of like, what is this book about? But you have said that what you were looking at was this idea of language. What is language trying to do, and when does it succeed and when does it fail? Would you mind saying a little bit more about that? Because obviously you've got the different forms of language in this book. You've got the poetry, you've got this idea of connection, disconnection, when are words enough and when are they not enough? Why is that such a fascinating thing to write into?
So language to me is like the pattern on, say, old curtains or something. That it's nice, but it dates the way we construct it. And that slight patina of datedness is really interesting in when Phil writes his poems or whatever, and we can see things in his chapter now that weren't apparent to him even as he was writing it. So that is really lovely to play with. Nell can't speak any other way. You have to get the sense of how the character is at the peak of their selfness. And that contains so much information. There's so much information in the cadences, in the accent, in what they say and can't say. And Nell is not a tactful kind of speaker. She says things the way young people say things, almost a little bit to shock, I suppose. Whereas Carmel can't say some stuff at all. And Phil doesn't even know that he's kind of lying to himself. Phil thinks he's been honest. But we look at his language and we go, yeah, okay. Is that too complicated an answer? I want the characters to be fully expressed as themselves at a point in time.
And then I suppose the reader then completes that process, right? So that these gaps that you have in the book.
So the gaps, the gaps. Well, you don't want to be too plodding, and your choices are also intriguing to yourself as you're writing the book. You say, why am I landing here? So technically you have to fill a bit of the backstory here and there. I'm actually getting more adept at that. It's less of a head wreck. But you just say, no, this is important. I'm going to stay here. This is important. This will yield what the story is about at the now. So, as I say, the longer I write, the more my answer is it feels right. You stay where it feels right.
And that feels like the right place in which to finish our conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. Thank you. That was very pleasant.
There we go. It's very pleasant.
Now the socks will follow me around. Oh.